Between the 4th and 15th centuries, the great cities of Egypt, Alexandria, Fustat, and Cairo were crowded urban worlds shaped by Egyptian life and memory. Here, one careless act could ripple through streets and markets until authorities chose the simplest solution: erase the act itself, ban it forever, and preserve urban order in medieval Egyptian cities. If these quiet stories of the past help your breathing slow and your thoughts soften into the night, you are always welcome to remain here. We would be grateful for your subscription, as it quietly supports long-form storytelling without noise, urgency, or performance. It helps protect this calm space where history moves at its own pace and speaks in a low voice. Your presence allows more evenings like this to exist, more patience, more stillness, more careful listening. There is no rush. Return whenever the world feels too loud. We will be here, quietly waiting. If this quiet hour feels comfortable, you're welcome to stay. We hope you will choose to subscribe, helping these calm nights continue, one story at a time. No rush, no noise, just history, moving slowly together. Things banned forever because one person ruined it for everyone. This story does not begin with a villain, a decree, or a thunderous proclamation from a palace balcony. It begins much more quietly, the way most permanent rules do, in the narrow streets of Egyptian cities, where walls leaned toward one another and voices carried farther than intended. It began with a single moment that went just slightly wrong. A sound raised at the wrong hour, a gathering that lasted too long, a habit repeated once too often in a place that could not afford repetition. From the 4th to the 15th century, cities like Alexandria, Fustat, and later Cairo were among the most crowded urban environments in the known world. These were not ceremonial capitals built for spectacle. They were living cities breathing constantly, crowded with traders, porters, sailors, scholars, craftsmen, pilgrims, animals, carts, water carriers, and children who had learned early how to move sideways through a crowd. Space was precious. Silence was rare. Stability was fragile. In such cities, the margin for error was thin. One person's small mistake did not stay small for long. It traveled, it echoed, it was repeated, exaggerated, misunderstood, and eventually feared. And fear, more than morality or theology, was the true engine behind many of the bans that shaped daily life in medieval Egypt. The modern imagination likes to believe that things are banned because they are inherently dangerous, sinful, or irrational. But in medieval Egyptian cities, most prohibitions were far more practical than that. They were not born from abstract ideas of right and wrong. They emerged from experience. Specifically from the experience of watching one incident turn into 10, 10 into chaos, and chaos into something the city could not easily repair. These cities did not have the luxury of individualized justice as we understand it today. There were no long investigations, no detailed psychological profiles, no patient attempts to fix behavior while preserving the habit. When something caused trouble, the question was not who did it, but whether it might happen again. If the answer was yes, the solution was simple and final. The thing itself was removed from the city's rhythm. It is important to understand how close together life unfolded in these places. In Alexandria, apartment blocks rose several stories high, with families stacked above workshops, shops, and storage rooms. In Fustat, lanes twisted tightly around markets and mosques, with homes opening directly onto the street. In Cairo, entire neighborhoods shared courtyards, wells, ovens, and walls, thin enough to transmit laughter, arguments, and late-night singing without effort. Privacy existed, but it was negotiated rather than guaranteed. In this environment, behavior was never purely personal. Everything had an audience. Everything had consequences beyond intention. A drum beaten at night did not only entertain, it disturbed sleep, unsettled animals, drew crowds, and created confusion. A gathering meant for celebration could block movement, provoke rival groups, or become a cover for theft. A single person pushing a boundary could unintentionally invite many others to follow. Authorities in medieval Egypt, whether administrative or religious, were acutely aware of this. Their primary concern was not moral perfection, but continuity. Cities survive through repetition. Water must be delivered. Bread must be baked. Markets must open and close on time. Prayers must be heard without becoming flashpoints. Anything that threatened this quiet machinery was treated with suspicion. When a problem appeared once, it was tolerated. Twice, it was noted. The third time, it became a pattern. And patterns were dangerous. Patterns spread faster than individuals. A bad habit adopted by many was far harder to stop than a single offender. So the logic hardened quickly. If something had shown itself capable of disrupting the city's balance, it was safer to remove it entirely than to trust people to behave better next time. This is how many bans were born, not in anger but in exhaustion, not in cruelty, but in the weary calculation of officials and community leaders who understood that cities like these could not absorb repeated shocks. One fire could burn hundreds of homes. One panic could injure dozens. One rumor could empty markets or incite violence. The city could survive hardship, but it could not survive unpredictability. Over time, these practical decisions began to acquire language that sounded moral, even spiritual. A restriction introduced to prevent disorder might later be explained as a matter of decency, piety, or respect. A ban rooted in crowd control could be reframed as a lesson in humility. This was not necessarily deception, it was translation. As generations passed, the original incident faded from memory while the rule remained. Most people living under these bans had no idea what single event had triggered them. They only knew that certain things were not done in public, at night or at certain times of year. They followed the rule because it had always been there, because breaking it felt dangerous, because elders warned them that trouble followed those who ignored it. And in a sense, the elders were right. Even if the original reason was forgotten, the conditions that had made the ban necessary often remained. The streets were still narrow. The crowds were still dense. The margin for error was still thin. This is why many prohibitions in medieval Egyptian cities lasted far longer than anyone expected. Once established, a ban did not ask for permission to endure. It simply repeated itself until repetition felt like truth. Children learned it before they understood it. Adults enforced it without remembering why. Eventually, the rule became part of the city's texture, as ordinary as the call to prayer or the closing of the gates at night. There is a quiet irony here. These cities were among the most sophisticated urban centers of their time, filled with scholarship, trade, and cultural exchange. Yet their survival depended not on constant innovation, but on restraint, on knowing when to stop something rather than refine it, on accepting that in a place this crowded, freedom sometimes had to yield to predictability. This does not mean the cities were joyless or rigid. Life continued vibrantly within the boundaries that remained. People laughed, celebrated, argued, and lived full lives. But they did so within a framework shaped by earlier mistakes. A framework built not to punish, but to prevent recurrence. In this sense, the bands we are about to explore are not stories of tyranny. They are stories of cities learning their limits, of communities discovering, sometimes painfully, that they could not afford to let certain behaviors repeat themselves. Of one person, long forgotten, whose moment of excess or carelessness taught an entire city a lesson it would never quite unlearn. As the night settles over these ancient streets, it becomes easier to understand this logic. In the quiet hours when sound travels far and movement is more noticeable, order feels precious, fragile, worth protecting. And so the city chooses continuity over forgiveness, stability over second chances. This is not a story about blame, it is a story about memory, about how urban life remembers not names, but consequences, and how, in medieval Egypt, a single mistake could echo for centuries, shaping what was allowed, what was forbidden, and what quietly disappeared from daily life forever. Now, with that rhythm in mind, we can begin to look more closely at the kinds of things that vanished from these cities, not because they were evil, not because they were strange, but because once, just once, they proved that the city could not afford to let them happen again. Before we begin naming what was banned, it helps to understand the kind of cities we are standing inside. Medieval Egypt was not a place of wide boulevards or generous distances. Alexandria, Fustat, and Cairo were built for living, not for breathing space. Walls pressed inward, streets folded over themselves. Sound traveled faster than intention. A single action rarely remained singular for long. In these cities, nothing happened in isolation. A choice made by one person was immediately absorbed into the collective rhythm of the street. A laugh carried into a window that had not asked for it. A gathering spilled into a passage that had already reached its limit. A habit repeated in one quarter quietly crossed into another. What began as personal expression often ended as public disturbance, not because it was malicious, but because the city itself was already full. This is where many misunderstand the bans that shaped medieval Egyptian life. They imagine sudden severity, moral panic, or abstract religious rigidity. In reality, most prohibitions emerged slowly after something ordinary proved itself unable to remain contained. The city did not ask whether a behavior was good or bad in theory. It asked a simpler question: can we survive if this happens again? The answer was often no. Urban Egypt did not have the luxury of second chances written into infrastructure. Fire spread easily. Crowds gathered quickly. Rumors outran corrections. Night concealed as much as it calmed. When something went wrong once, it suggested not an exception, but a vulnerability. And vulnerabilities, once exposed, demanded closure. So the response was rarely surgical. It was decisive. Instead of fixing the person, the city fixed the pattern. Instead of correcting behavior, it removed the possibility of repetition. This is how entire practices disappeared. Not dramatically, but quietly, folded into regulations, customs, and eventually moral language. Over time, these bans stopped sounding practical and started sounding virtuous. What was once about preventing unrest became a lesson in propriety. What began as crowd control was retold as discipline. The memory of the original incident faded, but the rule remained, polished by repetition until it felt timeless. Most people living under these restrictions did not feel oppressed by them. They felt protected. Predictability is comforting in dense cities. Knowing what not to do can be as stabilizing as knowing what is allowed. In a place where life constantly brushed against others, restraint was not a loss, but a form of cooperation. And yet beneath this calm surface, there is always the quiet presence of that first mistake. The forgotten individual who crossed a line the city could not afford to redraw. The moment that taught an entire population that forgiveness was riskier than prohibition. These stories linger not as names or dates, but as absences, as things no longer done, sounds no longer heard, gatherings no longer permitted. As we move into the specific examples, it is worth keeping this perspective close. These bans are not curiosities. They are solutions. Imperfect, human, sometimes excessive solutions to a problem every city still faces today. How to allow life to flourish without letting it spiral out of control. This is where the story truly begins. Not with the bans themselves, but with the fragile balance they were meant to protect. A city that could not absorb mistakes. In the cities of medieval Egypt, space was not something you owned. It was something you borrowed briefly and returned immediately to the crowd. Alexandria, Fustat, and Cairo were not designed for distance or solitude. They were designed to function, to move people, goods, water, and information through streets that rarely rested. Everything about them suggested motion, closeness, and the quiet acceptance that life would always brush against someone else. Houses leaned toward one another as if sharing secrets. Upper floors extended outward, narrowing streets below until sunlight arrived only in fragments. Markets layered themselves on top of older markets. A spice stall pressed against a cloth seller who leaned into a baker who shared a wall with a home where 3 generations slept above a single room. In these cities, walls separated families, but sound ignored them completely. Alexandria had already lived many lives by the medieval period. Greek, Roman, Christian, and Islamic layers sat on top of one another like sediment. Its port never truly slept. Ships arrived with grain, papyrus, oil, people, rumors, and diseases. Every arrival disturbed the balance slightly. Every departure left a small gap, quickly filled by something else. The city had learned long ago that control was not about stopping movement, but guiding it just enough to prevent collapse. Fustat, younger but no less crowded, grew rapidly after the Arab conquest. It was practical, dense, and unapologetically urban. Streets were narrow because land was valuable. Homes were built close because security mattered. Markets expanded until they touched one another because trade was life. The city did not sprawl. It compressed. And compression, while efficient, made everything sensitive. A single disruption could travel across neighborhoods before anyone fully understood what had happened. Cairo, which later absorbed Fustat into its shadow, refined this density even further. By the time it emerged as a dominant urban center, it was already accustomed to crowds. Pilgrims, scholars, officials, craftsmen, and travelers passed through constantly. Mosques anchored neighborhoods. Markets radiated outward. Residences filled every available space between institutions. Privacy existed, but it was negotiated daily through timing, silence, and restraint. In such environments, behavior was never private for long. A raised voice belonged to the street. A dispute became public property. A celebration, unless carefully contained, invited participation from those who had not been invited. This was not because people were intrusive. It was because the city itself offered no buffer. Sound, movement, and emotion traveled freely. This is why medieval Egyptian cities were unusually sensitive to disorder. Not moral disorder, but physical and social disruption. Anything that caused crowds to gather unexpectedly, noises to erupt at the wrong time, or routines to fracture without warning was treated as a threat. Not a dramatic one, a practical one. The danger was not the act itself, but its speed. A mistake in a village might remain local. A mistake in a city like Cairo multiplied almost immediately. One person's choice became a signal to others. One violation suggested permission, and permission, once implied, was difficult to retract. Authorities understood this well. They did not imagine citizens as isolated individuals making independent choices. They saw patterns, movements, ripples. A single incident was never evaluated alone. It was assessed as a preview of repetition. The question was never, who did this? But what happens if this becomes normal? If the answer threatened sleep, trade, prayer, or the steady movement of the city, the response was swift and blunt. The behavior was removed, not adjusted, not refined, removed. This logic can feel harsh to modern sensibilities, but within the medieval Egyptian city it was almost gentle. There was a strange mercy in choosing prohibition over constant surveillance. Instead of watching everyone all the time, the city simply declared certain actions out of bounds. People adapted quickly. They always did. Most residents understood this instinctively. Life in these cities required a high tolerance for proximity. You learned when to speak quietly, when to move aside, when not to draw attention. Courtesy was not politeness in the modern sense. It was spatial awareness, a way of not becoming a problem. Children learned early that certain actions carried consequences far beyond reprimand. A stone thrown in anger might break a window. A broken window might provoke retaliation. Retaliation might draw families, neighbors, factions. Before long, something trivial could become unmanageable. So the city taught restraint by example, and when example failed, it taught restraint by elimination. Over time, this produced an environment where bans felt almost organic. They were not always announced loudly. Sometimes they emerged gradually. A sound was tolerated less often. A gathering was discouraged. A practice faded. Eventually, it was simply gone. No one remembered exactly when or why, only that it was no longer done. This disappearance is crucial to understanding medieval urban life in Egypt. Bans did not always feel like force. Often they felt like silence, like the absence of something once familiar. A night without drums, a market without shouting after dark, a street that closed earlier than it used to. People adapted because adaptation was survival. These cities rewarded those who blended into the rhythm. Those who did not were remembered not as rebels, but as inconveniences. And inconvenience in a city this dense was intolerable. There is a quiet irony here. The same density that made these cities vulnerable also made them resilient. They could absorb loss. Fires were rebuilt. Plagues passed. Dynasties changed. But what they could not absorb was unpredictability layered on unpredictability. They needed repetition, routine, the reassurance that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to be navigable. This is why banning something entirely often felt safer than trusting people to behave better next time. Trust required space, distance, time. Medieval Egyptian cities had very little of any of those. So when a single person ruined something, it was rarely personal. It was structural. The city did not have the capacity to isolate the mistake from the pattern, and so it removed the pattern. As we move deeper into this story, it will become clear that many of the bans that shaped daily life were not expressions of fear, but of fatigue. The fatigue of managing crowds, of repairing damage, of calming unrest, of pretending that individual choices did not echo outward. The city learned, slowly and firmly, that it could not afford generosity in every case. Some things, once proven dangerous to the rhythm, were not given a second chance. And so Alexandria, Fustat, and Cairo became cities that remembered not through monuments alone, but through absences, through what was no longer allowed, through the quiet understanding that in a place this full, one mistake was sometimes all it took. What made these Egyptian cities particularly sensitive was not only their density, but their memory. Urban memory did not live in books or proclamations. It lived in habit, in the way shopkeepers closed earlier after a disturbance, in the way neighbors glanced at one another when a sound lingered too long, in the way certain actions, once tolerated, began to draw silence instead of participation. When something went wrong in Alexandria or Cairo, it did not reset the next morning. It stayed. It altered behavior quietly. People adjusted routes, changed hours, avoided corners. The city absorbed the lesson not through instruction, but through repetition. This is how a single incident could shape years of conduct without ever being officially remembered. Crowds were the city's greatest strength and its greatest risk. A crowd could move goods faster than any decree. It could spread news faster than messengers. It could turn a market into a miracle of coordination. But it could also turn restless without warning. A raised voice could become a rally. A rumor could become a verdict. And in streets where people already stood, shoulder to shoulder, a crowd did not need encouragement. It only needed permission. This is why authorities feared not crime, but momentum. Crime could be punished. Momentum was harder to stop. Once a behavior caught on, once it became part of the shared rhythm, removing it required more force than allowing it ever did. So they learned to intervene early, decisively, sometimes excessively. From the outside, it can look severe. From within, it felt preventative. In these cities, even joy required management. Celebration was welcome, but only in forms that could be predicted. Laughter was accepted, but not when it spilled into disorder. Music was appreciated, but not when it gathered the wrong kind of attention at the wrong hour. Anything that disrupted sleep, prayer, or the movement of goods was treated with suspicion, regardless of intention. It is tempting to imagine medieval Egyptian cities as places of constant surveillance and strict enforcement. In reality, much of the control was delegated to the population itself. People knew what drew trouble. They knew what made authorities nervous. They learned to regulate one another long before official intervention arrived. A neighbor's warning was often enough. A shared look, a closed door, a sudden quiet. This social self-regulation was born of necessity. Formal enforcement could not be everywhere, but habit could. Habit moved faster than guards, And once a habit changed, it rarely changed back. This is where the permanence of bans truly took hold. They became embedded in daily life, not as commands, but as absences. Over generations, these absences accumulated. Streets grew quieter at night. Gatherings became smaller. Expressions became more contained. Not because people were less expressive, but because expression had learned where it was welcome and where it was not. The city trained its residents gently, persistently, until restraint felt natural. There is a subtle humor in this if one listens closely. A single person long forgotten becomes responsible for a rule that shapes thousands of lives, not because they were notorious, but because they revealed a weakness the city could not ignore. Their mistake mattered not for its drama, but for its timing. It happened at the wrong moment in the wrong place, in a city already stretched thin. The city did not remember their name, it remembered the effect. And so the rule remained. Passed down not as a story, but as a condition. Something like weather, something like gravity. You learn to live with it, around it, without ever asking who caused it or why. This is the quiet power of urban Egypt in the medieval centuries. It did not need constant justification. It relied on continuity, on the understanding that if something had been removed, there was probably a reason, and that reason did not need repeating. The city trusted its own past judgments more than it trusted present impulses. As night settled over these dense neighborhoods, this logic felt almost comforting. Silence meant safety. Predictability meant rest. Knowing what not to do reduced anxiety more than freedom ever could. In a world where so much was uncertain, the certainty of prohibition was oddly calming. And this is the environment in which the first bans took root. Not dramatic, not ideological, but practical. The result of cities learning, sometimes painfully, that they could not afford generosity toward behaviors that threatened their fragile balance. From here we can begin to examine the specific kinds of actions that disappeared from these streets, the sounds that faded, the gatherings that shrank, the habits that once seemed harmless, until one person proved that the city could not risk them ever again. What the city ultimately learned was not how to punish, but how to prevent memory from repeating itself. Prevention in these dense Egyptian cities was not a loud act. It was quiet. It was the removal of possibility. When something vanished from daily life, it did not leave a scar. It left a gap that quickly felt normal. People adapted because adaptation was the city's oldest skill. Alexandria had adapted to empires arriving and leaving. Fustat adapted to rapid growth and administrative change. Cairo adapted to becoming a center that never truly rested. Each adaptation required letting go of something, sometimes a building, sometimes a custom, sometimes a freedom that had proven too loud, too unpredictable, or too contagious. The logic was rarely explained because it did not need to be. Explanation invites debate. Debate invites repetition. And repetition was exactly what the city was trying to avoid. Instead, rules settled into place like dust on stone, gradually, invisibly, until they were no longer questioned. This is why so many bans from medieval Egyptian cities feel strangely impersonal. They do not point fingers, they do not tell stories. They simply exist. They function without narrative. The city did not care who ruined something. It cared only that it had been ruined once, and that once was enough. From a modern distance, it is tempting to look for villains, to imagine reckless individuals who brought joy or chaos and paid for it with prohibition. But this misunderstands the scale at which the city operated. The individual was never the unit of concern. The street was, the neighborhood, the flow of bodies through space. In a place where water had to reach everyone, bread had to be baked daily, and sleep had to arrive eventually, the city could not indulge in prolonged tolerance for disruption. It did not have the luxury of experiments. It ran on habit, and habit demanded consistency. There is something almost tender in this strictness. The city did not ban things out of cruelty. It banned them out of care for its own continuity. It chose the blunt instrument of prohibition because finer tools were unavailable. Surveillance was limited. Policing was uneven. Memory was unreliable. But banning something entirely was simple. It worked. And so, over centuries, medieval Egyptian cities became places where absence carried meaning, where silence after certain hours was not emptiness but agreement, where restraint was not repression but cooperation, where people learned to live close without constantly colliding. This closeness shaped everything that followed. It shaped how sound was treated, how gatherings were viewed, how celebration was timed, how behavior moved from being merely inconvenient to being unacceptable. The city learned that it could survive many things, but not unpredictability layered upon unpredictability. By the end of this long learning process, the city no longer needed to remember the original mistake. The rule had outlived it. The ban had become part of the urban climate, and climate once established does not ask for permission to endure. It simply repeats itself until repetition feels like truth. This is the foundation on which all later prohibitions rest. Not theology, not ideology, but density, proximity, and the quiet understanding that in a city this full, one mistake was sometimes more than enough. With this in mind, we can now begin to look more closely at the specific things that disappeared from these streets, not as moral failures, but as practical casualties of urban life. Each one carries the same underlying lesson. In medieval Egypt's crowded cities, survival often mattered more than forgiveness. And that lesson, once learned, was never forgotten. Order before the individual. In medieval Egyptian cities, law did not begin with the individual, it ended there. The starting point was always the community, the street, the shared rhythm of daily life that made survival possible in places where people lived too close to imagine themselves as separate. Alexandria, Fustat, and Cairo were not designed for personal autonomy. They were designed for continuity. This is often difficult to grasp from a modern perspective where rules are written with individuals in mind and exceptions are carved carefully around personal circumstances. In urban Egypt between the 4th and 15th centuries, exceptions were dangerous. They suggested flexibility, and flexibility suggested unpredictability. The city did not distrust people, it distrusted chaos. Law, therefore, was not a moral instrument aimed at correcting character. It was a stabilizing weight placed on the city itself. Its purpose was not to ask why someone acted, but to ensure that whatever happened would not happen again, in a way that disrupted shared life. Responsibility was rarely personal. It was collective by design. This is why punishment often felt indirect. When one person caused disorder, it was not always that person who bore the lasting consequence. Instead, the behavior itself was restricted, removed, or reshaped so that no one could repeat it. The community absorbed the loss together, not because it was fair, but because it was effective. In dense cities, fairness was a luxury. Stability was not. Daily life depended on fragile cooperation. Water delivery followed predictable routes. Bread ovens served entire neighborhoods. Markets operated on trust, timing, and space that could not expand when strained. Prayer schedules overlapped with commerce. Streets had to clear at certain hours or nothing moved at all. In such an environment, a single disruption was never isolated. It delayed others. It irritated many. It unsettled routines that thousands relied upon without ever thinking about them. So law focused on outcomes, not intentions. Whether someone meant to cause trouble mattered less than whether trouble occurred. If an action produced unrest once, it revealed a vulnerability in the city's structure. The law's role was to seal that vulnerability, not to explore its emotional origins. This created a legal culture that can feel impersonal, even cold to modern readers. But to those living within it, it was reassuring. Rules were predictable. Boundaries were clear. You did not need to negotiate your behavior constantly. You simply learned where the edges were and stayed inside them. The city, in return, remained navigable. There is a quiet irony here. By refusing to focus on individuals, the law reduced the need for constant enforcement. People internalized restrictions quickly because they were framed not as personal judgment but as collective necessity. Breaking a rule was not framed as a moral failure. It was framed as endangering everyone else. And that carried a weight heavier than shame. In this system, blame dissolved into structure. The person who caused the first disturbance vanished from the story almost immediately. What remained was the rule, the adjustment, the closure. The city remembered the consequence, not the cause. This is why many medieval Egyptian laws feel strangely permanent. They were not designed to evolve with changing behavior. They were designed to prevent recurrence. Once a measure proved effective, there was little incentive to revisit it. Reopening a question risked reopening a problem. And problems were expensive. The cost was not abstract. Disorder meant lost trade, sleepless nights, heightened tensions, sometimes violence. The city measured harm not in principle, but in disruption. Anything that interfered with the shared ability to live side by side was treated as a threat to survival. So when a rule was introduced, it was rarely lifted. Lifting it required confidence that the original risk no longer existed. In cities that remained crowded for centuries, that confidence rarely arrived. Density did not decrease. Pressure did not ease. If anything, it intensified. This made law feel timeless, not because it was wise in every case, but because it fit the environment too well to discard. The city shaped the rule, and the rule reshaped the city in return. People grew accustomed to living within limits that felt natural because they had never known anything else. There is also a subtle humor in this arrangement, one the city itself seemed to understand. Everyone knew that rules existed because someone, somewhere, had failed to behave. But no one needed to say it out loud. The anonymity of blame preserved social harmony. Better to quietly accept restriction than to reopen old wounds by naming the mistake. And so the community paid the price together. A sound disappeared, a practice faded, a freedom narrowed, not as punishment, but as insurance. Insurance against repetition, against escalation, against the city turning on itself. This is the logic that underpins every ban we will encounter. Not cruelty, not superstition, but a steady preference for calm over correction, for silence over explanation, for stability over individual expression. As we move forward, keep this framework in mind. Each example is less about what was forbidden and more about what the city feared losing. Sleep, order, predictability, the ability to live closely without constant collision. In medieval Egypt, law did not ask who you were. It asked whether the city could afford what you did. What this meant in practice was that law in medieval Egyptian cities behaved less like a judge and more like a set of shutters. When something threatened to spill beyond its frame, the shutters closed, not angrily, not ceremonially. They closed because open space invited movement, and movement invited momentum. Momentum, once gained, was difficult to slow. Consider how quickly a single disturbance could expand. A disagreement in a market did not stay between two voices. Others paused. Stalls stopped moving goods. A small circle formed. Curiosity arrived before authority ever could. In a city where everyone lived within earshot, attention traveled faster than resolution. By the time officials arrived, the original issue no longer mattered. The crowd did. Law responded to this reality by refusing to personalize conflict, naming individuals only prolonged stories. Stories traveled, stories invited imitation. Silence, by contrast, ended them. Removing the behavior entirely removed the story. No hero, no villain, no memory to inspire repetition. This approach shaped how people understood responsibility. It was not about guilt. It was about consequence. If something you did created instability, the response was not always directed at you. It was directed at the conditions that allowed it to happen. The city treated causes structurally, not emotionally. There is something almost mathematical in this thinking. One action equals many reactions. Many reactions equal disorder, therefore remove the action. The equation ends. The city exhales. This logic extended beyond crime into ordinary life. Sounds, movements, timings, even gestures were evaluated by their potential to ripple. The question was never whether an action was meaningful to the person performing it. The question was whether it interfered with the collective ability to move through the day without friction. It is here that modern readers often misunderstand medieval Egyptian law as overly harsh. But harshness implies intent to harm. What we see instead is intent to preserve. Preservation of sleep, of trade, of prayer, of routine, of the invisible systems that made dense urban life possible. In such a framework, individuality was not erased. It was simply contained. Expression was welcome in places where it could not escalate. Celebration was allowed when it followed predictable forms. Innovation was tolerated when it did not fracture rhythm. The city did not suppress life. It channeled it. When that channel overflowed, however, the response was decisive. One overflow was enough to reveal that the channel was flawed, and flawed channels were closed. Over time, people learned to think this way themselves. You did not ask whether you were allowed to do something. You asked whether doing it would disturb others. That awareness became second nature. Self-restraint replaced enforcement. the law became less visible because it was no longer needed at every moment. This is how bans gained their quiet power. They did not need to be enforced loudly because they were enforced socially. Everyone knew that reopening a forbidden practice was not an act of freedom, but a risk imposed on neighbors. Few wanted to be remembered as the one who tested that risk. There is a gentle irony here, too. By placing community stability above personal intention, the law relieved individuals of constant moral performance. You did not need to justify yourself, you only needed to conform. Conformity, in this sense, was not submission, but courtesy, a way of acknowledging that the city was already full. And so when one person caused disruption, the response was not outrage, it was closure. The city closed ranks around itself, the individual faded from relevance, the rule remained. This is why so many medieval Egyptian regulations feel strangely anonymous. They are not attached to famous cases or notorious figures. They are attached to outcomes, to lessons learned once and never questioned again. As we continue, we will see how this legal philosophy shaped specific prohibitions, how sound became regulated, how gatherings were narrowed, how certain behaviors, once common, quietly vanished. Each example follows the same pattern, not blame, but containment, not correction, but removal. And beneath it all, the same guiding principle persists. In a city where everyone lives close, stability is not optional. It is the condition that allows life to continue at all. Eventually, this way of thinking reshaped how people understood the idea of justice itself. Justice was not about restoring balance between two individuals. It was about restoring balance to the city. If the city felt calm again, justice was considered complete. Whether someone felt personally wronged mattered less than whether the street returned to its usual rhythm. This helps explain why many rules in medieval Egyptian cities feel disproportionate when read today. A single incident could lead to a restriction that affected thousands, but the scale of the response matched the scale of the risk. When everyone shared walls, wells, and pathways, the cost of disruption was collective, so the remedy was collective as well. In this system, law was less a tool of correction and more a form of memory. It remembered what had gone wrong and quietly ensured it did not happen again. It did not need to punish visibly. It only needed to prevent recurrence. Over time, prevention became habit, and habit became culture. People adjusted their lives around these boundaries without much resistance because the boundaries were predictable. Predictability is deeply comforting in dense environments. Knowing what will not happen can be more reassuring than knowing what will. In a city that never truly emptied, certainty was a form of rest, and so the rules remained. Long after the original reason faded, they remained because the conditions that created them never fully disappeared. The streets stayed narrow, the crowds stayed dense, the stakes stayed high. Removing a restriction would have required confidence that the city had changed. It rarely had. There is a quiet kindness in this collective acceptance. Instead of repeatedly blaming individuals for inevitable missteps, the city chose to limit opportunity for error. It did not ask people to be better than human. It asked them to live within structures that reduced harm. This is why in medieval Egyptian cities, law often felt invisible. It blended into daily life. It became indistinguishable from custom. People did not experience it as constant pressure, but as background stability. The city held itself together through shared restraint. By the time we encounter specific bands later in this story, it is worth remembering that they were not sudden impositions. They were the end result of a long process of observation and adjustment. One disturbance revealed a weakness. The city responded. The response endured. And so when one person caused chaos, the city did not dwell on the person. It closed the door behind the action and moved on. The individual vanished from memory. The rule stayed. This is the quiet logic of medieval Egyptian law, not dramatic, not moralizing, simply practical, shaped by the understanding that in a place where lives overlapped so completely, stability was the highest form of care. With this framework in place, we can now turn to the first kinds of behaviors that disappeared from public life entirely. The ones that proved, just once, that the city could not afford to let them happen again. When permission quietly disappeared. In medieval Egyptian cities, very few things were banned because they were shocking. Most were banned because they were familiar. They had been allowed for a long time, long enough to feel ordinary, long enough to seem harmless. And then, once, at the wrong moment, in the wrong street, they caused more trouble than the city was willing to tolerate again. Sound was one of the first casualties of this process. Drums had always been part of urban life. They marked celebrations, announced arrivals, gathered attention, and stitched together moments of shared feeling. Shouting carried messages before written notices ever could. Singing eased labor and filled courtyards after sunset. None of this was inherently dangerous. In fact, much of it was useful. The problem was not the sound itself. It was what sound did to space. In narrow streets, noise did not disperse. It accumulated. It bounced between walls, climbed staircases, entered windows uninvited. A single drum beat could summon people who had not planned to gather. A raised voice could be mistaken for a call. A song could become a signal. And once attention shifted, the city's careful rhythm began to loosen. Authorities understood that sound could gather crowds faster than any decree, and crowds once gathered were unpredictable. They blocked movement. They delayed commerce. They invited conflict between groups that had not intended to meet. At night, they concealed as much as they revealed. Darkness turned sound into speculation. Speculation turned into fear. It only took a few incidents for this to become clear. A drum beaten late into the night drew people from nearby streets. Someone shouted back. Someone else joined. The gathering swelled. A disagreement broke out. In the confusion, theft occurred, or a fight, or something worse. By morning, the details were blurred, but the damage was done. No one needed to repeat the experiment. The response was not to ban joy or expression in theory. It was to limit sound in practice. Nighttime noise was restricted. Drumming was confined to certain occasions. Shouting became suspect after certain hours. Singing, once a private comfort, was discouraged when it spilled into public space. Over time, these limits hardened. What had once been situational became absolute. Not because the city disliked sound, but because sound had proven it could mobilize people too quickly. And speed, in a dense city at night, was dangerous. There was also another concern, quieter but no less important. Noise provided cover. In the confusion of sound, other actions disappeared. Footsteps blended in, voices masked intent. Crimes became easier to commit and harder to trace. Silence, by contrast, exposed movement. It made the unusual visible, so the city chose quiet. Not total silence, of course, cities never achieve that, but a controlled quiet, a sense that after a certain hour the street belonged to rest, not expression. This quiet was framed as propriety, but it functioned as security. It reduced uncertainty. It narrowed the range of possible disturbances. Nighttime gatherings followed a similar path. Gathering itself was not forbidden. Markets required crowds, prayer required assembly, festivals required presence. But gatherings after dark carried a different weight. Darkness dissolved distinctions. It hid faces. It softened boundaries between groups. What began as social could become confrontational without warning. A few incidents were enough to change the city's tolerance. A group gathered to talk, another joined. Alcohol or excitement sharpened tempers. An argument escalated, blades appeared, or fists, or simply fear. The aftermath lingered far longer than the event itself. Once again, the city responded not by identifying individuals, but by limiting conditions. If night gatherings had proven volatile, then night itself became the problem. Curfews emerged, not always announced dramatically, but enforced through custom. People learned when to go home, when doors should close, when streets were no longer social spaces. These restrictions gradually took on moral language. Staying out late became framed as improper. Gathering at night suggested irresponsibility. But beneath the moral surface was a practical calculation. Fewer people outside meant fewer interactions. Fewer interactions meant fewer chances for escalation. Over generations, this logic settled into something resembling an ethical curfew, not enforced solely by guards, but by expectation. Neighbors noticed when someone lingered too long, shopkeepers closed at familiar hours, streets emptied naturally, the city exhaled. What is striking is how quickly these changes felt natural. People adapted without nostalgia. They did not mourn the loss of late-night gatherings as freedoms taken away. They accepted them as conditions of urban life. The city taught them that rest was safer than excitement, that predictability was kinder than possibility. There is a quiet irony in all of this. The actions that were banned were not extraordinary. They were ordinary: sound, conversation, presence, things humans do instinctively. And yet in cities as dense as Alexandria, Fustat, and Cairo, even instinct required management. The city did not forbid these things because it feared people. It forbade them because it understood people too well. It knew how quickly curiosity turned into momentum, how easily momentum turned into disorder, how little it took for one person's evening to become everyone else's problem. So permission quietly disappeared. Not with anger, not with spectacle, just with repetition. A sound discouraged here, a gathering broken up there. Eventually people stopped trying. What was once allowed faded into memory. The city adjusted. It always did. And this is the pattern we will continue to see. Not sudden bans, but gradual narrowing. Not villains, but vulnerabilities. Not moral panic, but urban fatigue. As we move forward, we will see how other everyday practices followed the same path. Allowed, tolerated, questioned, and finally removed. All because once someone proved that the city could not afford to let it happen again. There was, beneath all of this, a deeper reason the city became wary of sound and nighttime presence. Sound creates ambiguity. It travels faster than meaning. In the dark, it detaches from its source. A laugh might sound like mockery. A shout might sound like alarm. A drum beat might sound like a summons. In cities already layered with tension, ambiguity was dangerous. At night, even familiar streets became unfamiliar. Shadows rearranged space. Corners lost definition. Faces dissolved into outlines. When people gathered under these conditions, intention was harder to read. And when intention was unclear, fear filled the gap. Fear does not need proof. It only needs uncertainty. The city learned this not through theory, but through repetition. A few gatherings that went wrong were enough. They did not need to be frequent. They only needed to be memorable. One fight that spread beyond its origin. One theft masked by noise. One disturbance that drew people out of their homes and refused to resolve quickly. The city remembered the aftertaste of these nights, long after the details faded. From then on, the night was treated differently. Daytime could absorb mistakes. People were awake, eyes were open, movement was expected. At night, everything slowed, and slowing magnified impact. A single disruption stood out sharply against quiet. It echoed longer. It felt heavier. So the city redefined night not as a continuation of day, but as a separate condition, one that required restraint. Doors closed earlier, streets narrowed in function, public life retreated indoors. This was not imposed violently. It emerged through shared understanding. People knew what the city tolerated and what it no longer wished to test. What is striking is how quickly these limits were accepted. There was little protest recorded because protest itself required gathering. And gathering after dark was precisely what had become suspect. The city's solution contained its own enforcement mechanism. By restricting nighttime presence, it reduced the possibility of resistance. Over time, the reasons became less important than the rhythm. Children grew up knowing that night belonged to rest, not expression. They did not question why drumming stopped after certain hours. They simply knew that it did. Silence became the expected sound of safety. This silence was not empty. It was active. It allowed sleep. It allowed recovery. It allowed the city to reset itself each morning. In a place where days were intense and crowded, night needed to be predictable. The city chose calm over excitement, not because it disliked joy, but because it valued continuity. There is a gentle, almost humorous truth here. The city did not ban these practices because they failed often. It banned them because they succeeded too well at drawing people together. Sound and gathering were powerful. And power, when uncontrolled, was risky. So they were narrowed, contained, redirected. Celebration moved to daylight, expression moved indoors. The street at night became a passage rather than a stage. This transformation did not erase social life. It reshaped it. People still met, still talked, still shared stories, but they did so within boundaries the city could manage. Boundaries drawn not by ideology, but by experience. As a result, many later generations came to see these restrictions as moral truths rather than practical decisions. Nighttime quiet was framed as virtue, early retreat as discipline, restraint as respectability. The original cause was forgotten, but the behavior remained. This is how a city teaches itself to sleep. And this is only one category of things that followed this path. As we continue, we will see how other everyday practices, once accepted without question, were slowly edged out of public life after proving themselves just a little too disruptive for a city that could not afford uncertainty. By the time these limits settled fully into place, they no longer felt like rules. They felt like weather, something the city simply had, something you moved within, adjusted to, and rarely questioned. People did not speak of bans when they described their nights. They spoke of custom, of what was done, of what was not. The street, once a place of shared sound after sunset, became a corridor of passage. It existed to take you somewhere else, not to hold you. Doors closed earlier, voices softened, footsteps learned to travel without announcement. The city, which had spent the day absorbing noise and motion, folded inward. This inward turn was not a retreat from life. It was a form of maintenance. Dense cities require rest as much as they require activity. And rest in places like Alexandria, Fustat, and Cairo could not be left to chance. It had to be protected. Over generations, people forgot that drumming had once been common at night. They forgot that shouting had once served as communication rather than disturbance. They forgot that gathering after dark had once been unremarkable. What remained was the absence. And absence, when inherited, feels natural. This is the quiet success of these bans. They did not remain controversial. They dissolved into expectation. Children learned them before they learned history. Adults enforced them without thinking of themselves as enforcers. The city carried on, lighter without the weight of constant negotiation. There is a soft irony in how thoroughly this worked. The city did not need to suppress desire. It only needed to redirect it. Sound found daylight. Gathering found sanctioned spaces. Expression found walls and courtyards instead of streets. Life continued, just more predictably. And predictability in medieval Egyptian cities was kindness. What had once been permitted did not vanish violently. It faded. It was edged out not by decree alone, but by collective agreement that some freedoms were too expensive to maintain. Not because they were immoral, but because they were uncontrollable in the spaces available. So when we say that these things were banned forever because one person ruined them for everyone, we are speaking less about blame and more about threshold. One incident was enough to reveal a limit the city had already reached. One disturbance showed that tolerance had run out, not emotionally, but structurally. The city did not ask whether it could forgive. It asked whether it could survive repetition. When the answer was no, permission quietly disappeared. This pattern would repeat itself again and again in other areas of urban life. Different behaviors, different contexts, the same conclusion. Something once allowed proved itself too volatile, too contagious, too costly, in a place where lives overlapped without pause. And so it was removed. As the night settled more deeply over these cities, silence became not a loss, but a shared understanding, a promise that tomorrow would arrive intact, that sleep would come, that the city would hold itself together for another day. With sound restrained and gatherings narrowed, the street learned how to rest. And the city, having learned this lesson once, never quite forgot it. when one mistake closed the street. In medieval Egyptian cities, consequences rarely followed individuals very far. Names faded quickly, faces disappeared into crowds. What endured instead was the adjustment made afterward. The city did not preserve memory through records of offenders. It preserved memory through absence. When something went wrong, there was rarely an appetite for investigation in the modern sense. Complex inquiries required time, manpower, and patience. Time was scarce. Manpower was already stretched. Patience in a city that could not afford another disturbance was a liability. The goal was not understanding. The goal was prevention. So the response moved outward rather than inward. Instead of narrowing focus onto a person, the city widened its solution to the behavior itself. If an action had caused trouble once, the simplest way to ensure it did not cause trouble again was to remove it from public life entirely. No follow-up, no monitoring, no waiting to see if it might be different next time. This was not indifference, it was efficiency. Urban Egypt functioned on a logic shaped by density. Every additional variable introduced into daily life increased the chance of friction. Tracking individuals meant allowing the behavior to continue in some form. Allowing continuation meant accepting risk. And risk, once demonstrated, was treated as unnecessary. The city preferred certainty over correction. This is how a single incident could reshape an entire neighborhood's routine. A disturbance in one street did not remain local. It cast doubt on the behavior everywhere else. If it had happened here, it could happen there. If it had happened once, it could happen again. The safest response was to close the possibility altogether. Streets were not closed physically, but socially. Certain actions were no longer welcomed. Certain times became off-limits. Certain spaces changed function. What had once been neutral ground became regulated terrain. The city recalibrated without ceremony. Residents understood this instinctively. They did not ask who had caused the change. They asked what was no longer done. The adjustment spread quietly. Shopkeepers altered hours. Neighbors spoke less at certain times. Movement narrowed. The street learned a new rhythm. There is a subtle shift here worth noticing. Responsibility moved away from the person and settled into space. The street itself became the object of protection. If something threatened the street's ability to remain calm, the city intervened on behalf of the street, not the individual. This approach spared the city prolonged conflict. Investigations invite argument. Argument invites sides. Sides invite repetition. By refusing to personalize blame, the city avoided reopening wounds. It did not need to declare guilt. It only needed to declare closure. In this system, justice was quiet. It did not announce itself. It did not demand recognition. It simply altered the environment until the problem could no longer arise. People adapted because adaptation was easier than resistance. Resistance required coordination. Coordination required gathering. And gathering, as the city had learned, was often the problem. There is an irony here that the city seemed to accept without discomfort. The innocent adjusted alongside the guilty. Those who had done nothing wrong still lived under new limits. But this was not seen as injustice. It was seen as shared insurance. Everyone paid a small price to avoid a larger one. This collective cost was one the city preferred. It was predictable. It could be absorbed. What the city could not absorb was the uncertainty of repeated disturbance. One fire was survivable, two suggested a pattern demanded elimination. Over time, this method created a city that felt strangely self-healing. A wound appeared. The city sealed it. Scar tissue formed in the shape of a rule. The scar remained, not as a reminder of pain, but as reinforcement. The city became slightly less flexible, but significantly more stable. People learned to read these scars. They knew which behaviors had been lost before they were born. They knew which streets carried unspoken limits. This knowledge was not written. It was inherited, passed through habit rather than explanation. And because the city rarely explained itself, the rules gained an air of inevitability. They were not argued with because they did not feel negotiable. They felt structural, like walls, like nightfall, like the closing of gates. This is why in medieval Egyptian cities, one person's mistake could ripple outward and harden into permanent change. Not because the city was cruel, but because it was tired of repairing the same damage twice. The city did not watch people closely. It watched outcomes. When an outcome threatened stability, it removed the pathway that led to it, quietly, permanently. And once removed, that pathway was rarely reopened. What is easy to miss is how little emotion accompanied these decisions. There was rarely outrage, rarely public anger. The city did not erupt in condemnation when a behavior disappeared. It adjusted. Adjustment was its native language. People noticed the change the way they noticed a new shadow at a familiar corner. Briefly, then not at all. This absence of drama was intentional. Drama spreads. Drama attracts attention. Attention invites imitation. The city had learned over long centuries that the safest response to disruption was to deprive it of narrative. No story, no names, no spectacle, just the quiet disappearance of possibility. In this way, rules in medieval Egyptian cities often felt older than they actually were. A restriction introduced after a recent incident could feel ancient within a generation. Children accepted it as part of the landscape. Adults stopped remembering when it had been different. Memory shortened. Stability lengthened. There is also something profoundly urban in this approach. Rural communities might negotiate, confront, or forgive. Cities did not have that luxury. Too many people depended on systems that could not pause for moral reflection. Water still needed to arrive. Markets still needed to open. Prayers still needed quiet. The city moved forward even while it closed doors behind itself. What disappeared was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was a sound at a certain hour, sometimes a practice in a particular place, sometimes a way of using space that had proven too porous. These small closures accumulated, shaping the city into something slightly more rigid but far more predictable. Residents rarely experienced this as oppression. They experienced it as relief. The street felt calmer. Nights felt safer. Movement felt easier when fewer variables were in play. People learned that losing a freedom they rarely needed was preferable to living with constant tension. And so the logic reinforced itself. Each successful closure encouraged the next. Each avoided disturbance justified the method. Over time, the city became confident in its own instincts. It trusted removal more than reform, silence more than explanation, absence more than enforcement. There is a quiet humor in how impersonally this played out. Somewhere in the city's past, a single person acted in a way that tipped the balance. That person vanished from memory almost immediately. They did not become infamous. They did not become a cautionary tale. They simply became irrelevant. The city kept the lesson and discarded the name. In doing so, the city protected itself from obsession. Fixating on individuals would have required retelling the story again and again. Retelling would have kept the behavior alive. Forgetting the person while remembering the outcome was cleaner, safer. This is why even today it can be difficult to trace the origins of many medieval urban bands. The records are quiet, the explanations thin. What survives is the rule itself, standing alone, detached from the moment that created it. It feels arbitrary because its origin has been deliberately erased. But within the city, it never felt arbitrary. It felt earned. The neighborhood that adjusted after one incident rarely questioned the change. They had seen what happened, or they had heard enough to understand that questioning was unnecessary. The city did not need universal agreement. It only needed compliance. And compliance in these conditions was rarely forced. It was practical. As we move forward, it becomes clear that this pattern did not apply only to sound or gatherings. It applied to gestures, tools, celebrations, and habits that once slipped easily through urban life. All it took was one moment when something slipped too far. The city responded the only way it knew how. It closed the street, not with chains, but with custom. It sealed the gap, and then it moved on. In the end, what mattered most was not who had acted, but what the city had learned. Medieval Egyptian cities did not preserve lessons through punishment. They preserved them through design. Streets changed function. Hours narrowed. Customs solidified. The city rewrote itself quietly until the original mistake could no longer find a place to land. This method spared the city from obsession with blame. Blame keeps wounds open. It demands retelling. Retelling invites memory. Memory invites imitation. By refusing to dwell on individuals, the city denied disruption the attention it needed to survive. The lesson was absorbed. The story ended. People adapted with remarkable speed. Within a few years, the altered routine felt normal. Within a generation, it felt inevitable. Within two, it felt ancient. No one argued for a return to what had been lost, because the city that had allowed it no longer existed in quite the same way. Conditions had shifted, density had increased, pressure had mounted. The past felt irrelevant. This is how collective punishment dissolved into collective habit. No one felt personally targeted. Everyone felt quietly protected. The city learned to think of itself as a single body, one that could not afford repeated injury. If something caused pain once, it was treated like a hazard rather than a moral failure. Hazards were removed, not debated. There is a restrained wisdom in this approach, not compassionate in a modern sense, but attentive. The city listened to what disruption revealed about its limits and responded accordingly. It did not ask people to change who they were. It changed the environment so that certain behaviors no longer made sense. In doing so, medieval Egyptian cities traded flexibility for endurance. They became less forgiving but more resilient. They accepted that some freedoms were incompatible with proximity, that some actions, once proven disruptive, were simply too expensive to risk again. And so the pattern held. One person made a mistake. The city closed a door. The neighborhood adjusted. The rule remained, not as a punishment, but as a precaution, not as a story, but as a structure. By the time the adjustment faded into habit, no one remembered the moment that caused it. The city did not need to remember. It had already changed. With this understanding, we can see how entire categories of behavior quietly vanished from urban life. Not because people forgot how to do them, but because the city forgot how to tolerate them. And in cities as dense as Alexandria, Fustat, and Cairo, forgetting how to tolerate something was often the most effective form of survival. The fear of the crowd. In medieval Egyptian cities, nothing unsettled authority more quietly or more deeply than the crowd. Not because crowds were always violent, but because they were always unpredictable. A crowd was a place where intention dissolved, where responsibility blurred, where no single voice could be separated from the noise that surrounded it. Markets were the most familiar example. They were essential, tolerated, and carefully watched. The market was where life happened openly. Goods changed hands. News circulated, disputes emerged, and were usually resolved quickly because daylight, commerce, and constant movement discouraged escalation. But even here, the balance was delicate. A raised price, a false weight, a harsh word. Any of these could pause the flow just long enough for attention to gather. Attention, once gathered, was the danger. Authorities understood that the problem was not anger, but stillness. As long as people moved, the city functioned. When people stopped moving, they began to watch. Watching turned into choosing sides. Choosing sides turned into momentum. And momentum, once formed, was difficult to dissolve without force. Festivals carried a different risk. They were sanctioned joy. But joy has a way of slipping its boundaries. Music drew people closer. Celebration softened restraint. Laughter loosened the edges that usually kept distance intact. For a time, this was welcomed. The city understood the need for release. But release required containment. A festival that stayed within its expected shape was harmless. One that spilled into neighboring streets, lingered too long, or attracted rival groups became something else entirely. The line between celebration and confrontation was thin, and once crossed, it was rarely crossed back easily. Funerals, too, were carefully observed. Mourning gathered people who shared grief, but grief can sharpen emotion rather than dull it. Processions moved slowly. Voices rose. Tears became accusations. In dense cities, funerals could turn from private sorrow into public statement. A crowd bound by emotion was harder to calm than one bound by commerce. Processions, whether religious or civic, combined all these risks. They stopped traffic. They redirected movement. They created spectators. Spectators became participants. Participation diluted control. What began as a display of unity could become a test of authority if the crowd grew too confident in its own presence. None of this required malicious intent. In fact, the most dangerous crowds were often sincere. Sincere in their devotion, sincere in their grief, sincere in their joy. Sincerity gave momentum legitimacy, and legitimacy, once felt, was difficult to retract. So the city responded by narrowing the conditions under which crowds could form. Markets remained, but with stricter oversight. Festivals continued, but shorter, quieter, or moved to daylight. Funerals were regulated in size and route. Processions were controlled in timing, path, and permission. Over time, some popular celebrations were reduced until they barely resembled their earlier forms. Others were moved indoors. Some were shifted to hours when participation would naturally thin, and some disappeared entirely, not because they were sinful, but because they had proven too effective at gathering people. The language used to justify these changes often sounded moral or theological. Excess was discouraged, modesty was praised, order was framed as virtue. But beneath the language was a practical fear that the city could not afford a moment when the crowd realized how many it was. Crowds reminded people that authority was relational, that it depended on consent, habit, and expectation. A crowd that lingered too long might begin to test those expectations, and testing, once begun, invited repetition. So the city learned to disperse rather than confront, to prevent rather than punish, to thin gatherings before they thickened. This approach felt less violent, less memorable, and therefore more effective. People remembered being told to go home. They did not remember being crushed by force. Gradually, this reshaped public life. The city became a place of smaller gatherings and shorter moments. Large expressions of shared emotion were treated with caution. Public joy was scheduled. Public grief was guided. Public movement was choreographed. And yet life did not become colder. It became quieter, more contained. The city learned to breathe without gasping. It accepted that crowds, while powerful, were also expensive. They demanded attention, resources, and risk. So many folk festivals shrank. Some were reduced to symbolic gestures. Others were redefined entirely. A celebration once rooted in communal excess became a brief ritual. A procession once open to all became invitation only. A public gathering became a memory passed down rather than an event repeated. This is how the fear of the crowd reshaped medieval Egyptian cities, not through constant repression, but through careful narrowing, through the steady belief that it was better to lose a festival than to lose control. And beneath that belief was a simple calculation. One small incident was enough to show how quickly joy could turn into disorder. The city did not need to see it twice. What made the crowd especially unsettling was not its size alone, but its ability to forget itself. Individuals entering a crowd often surrendered the small calculations that guided them through ordinary days. They stood longer, they spoke louder, they followed movement rather than intention. In the press of bodies, responsibility dissolved into atmosphere. Authorities and religious leaders understood this instinctively. They did not fear disagreement as much as they feared synchronization. When many people moved, reacted, or felt at the same moment, the city's usual mechanisms of control weakened. Guards could not be everywhere. Words lost precision. Signals multiplied. A crowd did not need leadership to become difficult. It only needed time. This is why so many regulations focused not on what crowds did, but on how long they were allowed to exist. Duration mattered. A gathering that dispersed quickly was manageable. One that lingered invited escalation. So events were shortened, routes were limited, moments were capped. The city learned to interrupt momentum before it hardened into presence. There was also a quieter concern beneath all of this. Crowds created witnesses, and witnesses remembered. A city that allowed too many shared moments risked creating shared narratives. Shared narratives could challenge official ones. Even without intention, memory itself could become political. So the city learned to fragment memory. Smaller gatherings produced smaller stories. Smaller stories faded faster. What could not be eliminated entirely was reduced until it no longer left a mark. Markets, which could not be removed, were regulated down to gesture and sound. Sellers were told how loudly they could speak. Buyers learned when to move on. Lingering became suspicious. Efficiency was encouraged not just for commerce, but for dispersal. Funerals, deeply emotional by nature, were guided gently but firmly. Routes avoided central intersections. Numbers were watched. Expressions of grief were contained, not out of cruelty but out of fear that sorrow, when shared too widely, could turn into accusation or unrest. Grief was allowed. Amplification was not. Processions were the most carefully managed of all. They combined movement, sound, symbolism, and spectatorship. They transformed the city temporarily, redirecting flow and attention. For this reason, they required permission. Permission implied limits. Limits implied control. Control implied survival. What is striking is how rarely force was required. Most people complied willingly. They understood the cost of non-compliance. They had seen or heard enough to know what happened when crowds exceeded their frame. The city did not need to remind them often. Over time, these limits reshaped how people imagined public life. The ideal gathering became smaller, the ideal celebration became quieter, the ideal expression became brief. Excess, once admired in communal contexts, became associated with risk. This shift did not eliminate joy, it redistributed it. Joy moved inward, into homes, into private courtyards, into small circles that could dissolve quickly if needed. The city encouraged intimacy over spectacle, not because intimacy was morally superior, but because it was safer. There is a gentle irony here. By fearing the crowd, the city preserved itself as a place where people could continue to live closely without constant conflict. The very restrictions that narrowed public life made private life more sustainable. People learned to celebrate without summoning the entire street. And so the city continued, wary but alive. It allowed crowds when it must, limited them when it could, and removed them when experience suggested they were too costly. One incident was often enough. The memory of chaos did not need repetition. As we move forward, this fear of the crowd will echo again and again, in rules about movement, in restrictions on sound, in the shaping of ritual and routine. Each reflects the same quiet conclusion, that in a dense city, the greatest danger is not anger or belief, but too many people feeling the same thing at the same time. In the end, what the authorities feared was not rebellion in its dramatic form, but accumulation. Too many bodies, too much noise, too much shared attention gathered in one place for too long. History had taught them that crowds rarely announce their turning point. They drifted into it. So the city learned to act early, quietly, and decisively. Festivals were not abolished all at once. They were trimmed, shortened, redirected. A procession that once crossed the entire city now ended after a single district. A celebration that lasted a night was reduced to an afternoon. A gathering that once welcomed everyone was quietly reframed. as invitation only. Nothing dramatic, nothing openly hostile, just less. This approach allowed rulers and religious leaders to claim balance rather than repression. Life continued. People still gathered. Joy was not forbidden. It was simply rationed, carefully, predictably, in amounts the city could absorb without trembling. And when an event crossed that invisible line, when laughter turned too loud, when grief lingered too publicly, when movement slowed rather than flowed, the response was rarely personal. No names were required, no investigation stretched on for months. The solution was structural. The event itself became the problem. A festival that caused unrest one year did not return the next. A route that encouraged congestion was erased from memory. A custom that gathered too many people too easily was labeled dangerous, improper, or spiritually unwise. The explanation changed. The result did not. Over time, the population adapted. People learned to read the city's limits the way sailors read currents. They sensed when to leave early, when to lower their voices, when not to linger. This was not fear exactly. It was fluency. Children grew up knowing which sounds belonged indoors, which emotions belonged to the home, which gatherings were safe because they ended quickly. The city trained its residents gently through repetition rather than punishment. The irony is that these restrictions did not make the city cold. They made it careful. Streets remained alive, markets continued, rituals endured. But everything carried an awareness of scale, of proportion, of the delicate balance between togetherness and disorder. Crowds were not evil. They were simply powerful, and power, in a dense medieval city, was something to be handled sparingly. By the time these rules had settled into habit, few people questioned them. They felt ancient, natural, as if the city itself preferred this quieter rhythm, as if Alexandria, Fustat, and Cairo had learned through fire, noise, and regret that survival depended less on expression than on restraint. And so the greatest fear of the authorities became an unspoken agreement shared by everyone that the city could hold many lives, many beliefs, many emotions, but not all of them at once. The crowd, when it appeared, would be guided, watched, limited, and when necessary, gently removed from the future, not out of cruelty, but out of memory. From urban practicality to discipline without memory. At the beginning, nothing here was philosophical. Nothing was meant to shape souls, values, or inner character. The rules that appeared in the cities of Alexandria, Fustat, and Cairo were not born from ideals. They were born from exhaustion. Too many people, too little space, too much noise, traveling too far, too fast. Urban authorities did not wake up one morning hoping to improve morality. They woke up hoping the city would survive the day without burning, rioting, or collapsing into confusion. Practical problems demanded practical solutions. And the most practical solution, again and again, was removal. If a sound caused unrest, remove the sound. If a gathering caused disorder, remove the gathering. If an action spread faster than it could be contained, remove the action entirely. At first, these bans were openly pragmatic. They were explained in plain language. This is unsafe. This causes panic. This leads to violence. This overwhelms the streets. The reasoning was mechanical, almost dull. It did not require belief, only observation. But cities outlive explanations. As generations passed, the original reasons faded, records thinned, officials changed, conditions shifted. What remained were the rules themselves, still enforced, still familiar, but increasingly detached from their origin. People stopped asking why something was forbidden. They learned instead that it was forbidden. And when a rule loses its practical explanation, it rarely disappears. It transforms. What had once been about crowd control slowly became about behavior. What had once been about safety was reframed as propriety. What had once prevented chaos was now described as refinement, decency, or correct conduct. Not because anyone planned this shift, but because memory has limits. A later generation does not inherit fear in its original form. It inherits habit, and habit needs justification. When the danger is no longer visible, the rule must find a new reason to exist. So a ban that began as security quietly acquired moral language. Not religious language and not divine language, but social language. This is not how respectable people behave. This does not suit a well-ordered city. This lacks discipline. Discipline became the replacement for danger. The city no longer said, "This will cause unrest." It said, "This reflects poorly on us." This shift made the rules stronger, not weaker. A security measure can be debated when danger seems absent. A moral expectation is harder to question because it frames obedience as character rather than necessity. People complied not because they feared consequences, but because disobedience felt improper. The city had succeeded in turning emergency responses into internalized behavior. And here's the quiet irony. The later population believed these rules had always been about virtue, about self-control, about dignity. They never saw the nights of panic, the crushed streets, the sudden violence that had forced the bans into existence. Those moments were gone. What remained was polish. The rules now taught restraint, where they once enforced survival. They shaped posture instead of movement, tone instead of volume, timing instead of urgency. A person no longer avoided certain actions because they were dangerous. They avoided them because they were not done. And so the city achieved something remarkable without ever intending to. It replaced external control with internal discipline. The streets became quieter not because guards watched them, but because people corrected themselves. Public life slowed not because it was ordered to, but because deviation felt uncomfortable. The original logic security had dissolved. The structure discipline remained. By this point, no one could point to the moment when necessity became custom. It had happened too gradually, too gently, too efficiently. And that is how urban rules endure the longest. Not by force, not by explanation, but by forgetting. When a rule survives long enough, it no longer needs its reason. It becomes part of the background, like the width of a street or the shape of a doorway. It simply is. People assume it reflects something timeless, something inherent, something about order itself. But in truth, It began with a problem no one remembers anymore. A night that went wrong. A crowd that grew too fast. A sound that traveled farther than expected. And the city, tired of repeating the same mistake, chose the simplest answer. Remove the action. Let the habit remain. Let the reason fade. Over time, this shift changed how people understood themselves inside the city. A rule was no longer something imposed from outside. It became something carried within. People learned to monitor their own behavior long before anyone else needed to notice. This was not fear in its raw form. It was anticipation. Anticipation is quieter than fear. It does not tighten the chest. It simply adjusts movement. A step slowed, a voice lowered, a gathering ended a little earlier than planned. Nothing dramatic, nothing memorable, which is exactly why it worked. Urban discipline matured into routine. What had once required enforcement now required only familiarity. The city trained its residents through repetition, not punishment. Each day reinforced the same small lessons. Move with the flow, not against it. Do not draw attention unnecessarily. Understand that excess attracts consequence. And consequence in a dense city rarely lands on just one person. This understanding shaped how responsibility was perceived. Actions were no longer evaluated solely by intent, but by effect. Whether someone meant to cause trouble mattered less than whether trouble appeared. The city did not have the luxury of investigating motives. It responded to outcomes. That is why many prohibitions felt impersonal. They were not judgments of character. They were adjustments to behavior. The city treated disruption the way it treated a blocked street or a broken well, as a problem to be removed, not debated. In this environment, discipline became spatial. It lived in distance, timing, and restraint. It taught people when not to gather, when not to linger, when not to insist. Self-control was not praised as virtue. It was expected as competence. Those who lacked it were not seen as immoral. They were seen as dangerous in the most ordinary sense of the word, not malicious, just risky. And risk, in a city that functioned on tight margins, was unacceptable. As generations passed, the language around these rules softened, but their effect hardened. People forgot the original chaos that had shaped them, but they remembered the calm that followed. Calm became the goal. Calm became the standard. This is how discipline survives longer than fear. Fear burns hot and fast. Discipline cools and settles. It becomes background noise like the hum of a city at night, barely noticed but always present. You do not think about it unless it stops. By the later centuries, people believed these limits reflected something natural about human behavior. They assumed crowds were meant to be managed, sound meant to be contained, movement meant to be regulated. The city's solutions felt obvious because the problems that created them were no longer visible. No one remembered the incident that caused the ban. They remembered only that lifting it felt unwise. This forgetting was not a failure. It was a feature. A city that remembers every crisis lives in constant tension. A city that forgets the crisis but keeps the solution lives in continuity. Stability depends less on memory than on habit. And so urban discipline settled into the rhythm of daily life, Not harsh, not cruel, simply there, guiding behavior quietly, shaping expectations gently, ensuring that the mistakes of the past did not need to be repeated in the present. The city did not ask people to be better. It asked them to be careful. And in places as crowded and layered as Alexandria, Fustat, and Cairo, careful was enough. By the time this transformation was complete, the city no longer needed to remember its reasons. It functioned on results. A behavior existed. It caused disruption. It disappeared. No moral lesson was required. No grand explanation followed. The city was not interested in reforming the individual. It was interested in preserving the surface of everyday life, streets that flowed, markets that opened and closed on time, nights that did not suddenly fracture into chaos. This is where urban discipline reached its quiet maturity. Rules were no longer debated as choices. They were accepted as conditions. Like heat, like dust, like crowding itself, you did not argue with them, you adapted. People learned to carry restraint the way they carried keys or money. It was part of moving through the city, knowing when to stop speaking, knowing when to leave, knowing when not to insist. None of this felt heroic. And that was the point. Heroism attracts attention. Attention attracts instability. The city preferred people who blended, not those who stood out, those who understood the invisible lines and did not test them unnecessarily. What is striking is how little resentment this produced, because these limits were not framed as punishment. They were framed as competence. To live well in the city meant knowing how not to cause problems. Those who failed were not condemned. They were simply corrected by the environment itself. Doors closed. Crowds withdrew. Opportunities vanished quietly. Social friction replaced force. Over time, this created a population skilled in anticipation. People sensed when something might go wrong and stepped away before it did. They read atmosphere the way others read text. A raised voice, a pause that lingered too long, a gathering that felt heavy instead of lively. This sensitivity was not fear-driven, it was practical intelligence. And so the original ban's once emergency measures taken in response to specific incidents became something else entirely. They turned into a framework for behavior, a shared understanding of limits that did not need to be written down anymore. Later generations inherited this framework without context. They assumed it reflected timeless wisdom. They believed it spoke about character, discipline, and proper conduct. They did not know it began with exhaustion and risk. But the city did not mind being misunderstood. It had learned that effectiveness mattered more than accuracy, that stability did not require explanation, only repetition. A rule that works does not need to justify itself forever. It only needs to continue working. And so the city moved forward quieter than before, calmer than memory suggested. Not because people had become more virtuous, but because the system had learned how to shape behavior without announcing itself. This is the final form of urban control, not command, not surveillance, but habit. A habit so old that no one questions it. A habit so gentle that it feels natural. A habit born from a single mistake no one remembers anymore. And in that forgetting, the city found its balance. bands that outlived memory. By this stage, the city no longer remembered its own turning points. The names were gone, the faces were gone. The exact moments that had caused fear, confusion, or disorder had dissolved into time. No one could say who had caused the problem. No one could describe precisely what had happened. The details had thinned, then vanished. What remained was simpler. This is not done. This should not happen. This has always been forbidden. The ban survived because memory did not. In dense cities like Alexandria, Fustat, and Cairo, forgetting was not a weakness, it was a kind of efficiency. Remembering every incident would have meant carrying constant tension. Forgetting the event while keeping the solution allowed the city to rest. People grew up learning limits without stories attached to them. A child did not hear, "This was banned because of a riot," or "This caused violence once." They heard only that it was improper, unsafe, or unwise. The explanation was no longer historical. It was customary. And custom has a unique power. It does not argue, it does not persuade, it simply repeats. Over time, repetition hardened into truth. A ban no longer felt temporary or reactive. It felt ancient. It felt as if it had always been there, as if it reflected something natural about how people should behave in a city. The rule detached itself from the moment that created it and attached itself to identity instead. This is how our city works. This is how people like us behave. Once a prohibition reaches this stage, it becomes almost impossible to remove, because removing it would require explanation, and explanation would require memory, and memory in this case no longer exists. The city cannot recall the danger clearly enough to debate whether it still matters, so it chooses caution. It chooses continuity. It keeps the ban not because it understands it, but because it trusts it. This is how bans become traditions. They are passed down without argument. They are enforced without urgency. They are accepted without resentment. People comply not because they fear consequences, but because disobedience feels strange, awkward, unnecessary. The rule no longer protects against a visible threat. It protects against uncertainty. And uncertainty is something cities dislike deeply. What is quietly remarkable is that these long-lived bans rarely feel oppressive. They are too old for that. They have softened with age. Their edges are worn smooth by generations of use. They exist as background structure, like the layout of streets or the rhythm of markets. Most people never encounter them directly. They only feel them as absence, an action that never quite forms, a possibility that never quite becomes tempting. This is simply not something we do. And so the city continues, guided by prohibitions whose origins are lost, whose purpose is assumed, and whose presence is barely noticed. The mistake that caused them has vanished completely, but its shadow remains, stretched thin across centuries. A single act once disrupted the flow. The city responded, the response endured, and long after the memory disappeared, the ban stayed behind, quietly doing its work, turning reaction into tradition and tradition into truth. Over time, these inherited prohibitions stopped feeling like rules at all and began to feel like the city's personality. People described them the way they described climate or architecture, not as decisions made by someone, but as conditions one simply learned to live within. You did not argue with them because there was no argument left to have. There was no villain to blame, no incident to reassess, no document to revise. The ban had crossed the quiet threshold from policy into atmosphere. It shaped behavior the way narrow streets shape footsteps, guiding movement without needing instruction. People adjusted instinctively, not because they agreed or disagreed, but because doing otherwise felt out of place, like speaking too loudly in an empty room. In this way, the city taught obedience without ever naming it as such. Compliance felt like belonging. To follow the rule was to signal that you understood the city, that you were fluent in its unspoken grammar. Breaking it did not make you rebellious so much as awkward, someone who had missed a cue everyone else seemed to know. This is how memory fades without consequence, because the function remains. The city does not require its inhabitants to remember the past. It only requires them to move correctly in the present. And so the prohibition continues, passed along not through explanation but through imitation, absorbed in childhood, reinforced in daily routine, and rarely examined closely enough to feel strange. The original mistake has been erased completely, not corrected, not forgiven, simply outlived. What remains is a smooth surface of habit, polished by centuries of repetition, where reaction has settled into tradition, and tradition has hardened into something that feels permanent. In this final form, the ban no longer prevents a specific danger. It prevents disruption itself. It preserves rhythm. It keeps the city predictable, navigable, calm enough to endure. And that, for a dense and patient city, has always been reason enough. By the time a ban reaches this point, it no longer belongs to law, policy, or authority. It belongs to time. It exists because it has existed for so long that removing it would feel more disruptive than keeping it. The city trusts duration more than logic. What has survived generations is assumed to deserve survival. This is why no one feels urgency around these prohibitions anymore. They do not demand attention. They do not provoke debate. They sit quietly in the background of daily life, shaping behavior through absence rather than command. People do not wake up thinking about what they are forbidden to do. They simply never consider doing it at all. The ban becomes invisible. And invisibility is power. When something no longer needs to be enforced, it has already won. It does not rely on fear or punishment. It relies on familiarity. It becomes part of how people imagine the boundaries of normal life. Not moral, not immoral, just unthinkable. At this stage, even those who break the rule rarely do so with intention. They stumble into it by accident, unaware that they have crossed a line. The reaction they receive is not outrage, but discomfort. A pause, a glance, a subtle withdrawal from those around them. The city corrects gently, socially, efficiently, and then it moves on. No one explains, no one documents, no one records the moment. The system does not need reinforcement. It has already folded itself into habit. This is how a single mistake, long forgotten, continues to shape generations that never witnessed it, not through fear of repetition, but through the quiet authority of continuity. The city does not remember the danger. It remembers only that avoiding it has worked. And so the ban remains, not as a warning, but as a rhythm, a soft boundary people rarely touch, a rule that feels less like a restriction and more like a contour of the city itself. Reaction has become tradition. Tradition has become instinct, and instinct no longer asks questions. That is how prohibitions outlive memory, and that is how cities endure. Not higher morality, but urban survival. In the end, none of this was about being better people. It was about staying alive. The cities of Egypt were not gentle environments. Alexandria, Fustat, and Cairo were brilliant, crowded, restless places, but they were also fragile. Heat pressed down for most of the year. Clean water was precious and unevenly distributed. Buildings stood close together, sharing walls, sharing air, sharing risk. Fire traveled faster than help. Illness moved faster than understanding. In such cities, survival depended on restraint more than expression. A single spark, dropped carelessly, could climb from one roof to the next before anyone realized what was happening. A moment of excitement, a sudden rush toward sound or spectacle could turn into crushing bodies in narrow streets where there was nowhere to fall except onto someone else. A gathering that lingered too long in the heat could spread sickness quietly, long before symptoms appeared. None of this required malice. It required only momentum. That is why many prohibitions targeted behaviors that were not evil, not cruel, not even particularly offensive. They targeted things that were enjoyable: loud celebrations, prolonged gatherings, nighttime movement, uncontrolled sound, lingering crowds. Individually, these actions felt harmless, even joyful. But cities do not measure danger by intention. They measure it by scale. One person singing loudly is entertainment. 100 people stopping to listen is congestion. Congestion in the wrong place becomes panic. The city learned this lesson repeatedly, and each time it chose the same response: not moral instruction, not appeals to responsibility, just removal. If an action repeatedly led to fire, it was banned. If it repeatedly led to injury, it was restricted. If it repeatedly led to disease, it disappeared. The ban was not a judgment of character, it was an admission of limits. The city could not afford to trust that everyone would always behave carefully. It could only afford to reduce risk. This is why later generations misunderstood these rules. From a distance, they look like attempts to impose discipline, propriety, or refinement, but up close, they are simply adaptations to environment. The city was not shaping virtue, it was managing vulnerability. Heat does not negotiate. Fire does not wait. Disease does not respect celebration. Urban survival required narrowing the range of acceptable behavior until the city could breathe again. What felt restrictive to the individual felt stabilizing to the whole. And so, over time, joy learned to soften itself. Movement learned to pause earlier. Sound learned to stay closer to home. The city did not become silent. It became careful. This care was not sentimental. It was learned through loss, through streets blocked by smoke, through markets emptied by illness, through nights when one small incident became too large to stop. The bans that followed were not expressions of fear. They were expressions of memory. Memory of what the city could not survive twice. So when something was forbidden, it was not because it offended sensibilities, it was because it threatened continuity. The city chose endurance over indulgence, stability over spontaneity. And in places where life pressed so tightly together, that choice was not harsh. It was necessary, not to make people better, but to make tomorrow possible. And once this is understood, many things fall gently into place. What looks from a distance like strictness begins to look more like accommodation. The city was not asking people to suppress joy forever. It was asking joy to stay small enough to survive. It was asking excitement to remain proportional to the space that had to hold it. In wide landscapes, excess can disperse. In dense cities, it collides. So the rules narrowed life, not because life was unworthy, but because it was crowded. A city built of stone, wood, fabric, and human breath cannot absorb unlimited motion. Every laugh echoes. Every footstep transfers weight. Every flame searches for something dry. The margin for error is thin. The cost of mistake is shared. This is why the city preferred prevention over correction. Once a fire starts, it is already too late. Once panic spreads, it does not retreat politely. Once disease moves, it does not wait for permission. Urban logic does not reward optimism, it rewards caution. And so the city learned to think ahead, even if it could not explain itself later. It removed behaviors not because they were wrong in principle, but because they were wrong for this place, at this density, under this sun. From the inside, these choices felt ordinary. People adjusted without drama. They found new ways to celebrate quietly, new ways to gather briefly, new ways to enjoy life without straining the city's limits. Human creativity did not disappear. It adapted. What disappeared instead was tolerance for risk disguised as pleasure. A rule did not say, "Do not enjoy yourself." It said, "Do not endanger everyone else while you do." Over centuries, that distinction faded. The rules remained, but the environment that shaped them became easier to forget. Later generations inherited the limits, without inheriting the heat, the smoke, the sickness, the close calls. From the outside, it looked like discipline. From the inside, it had always been survival. The city did not aspire to purity. It aspired to mourning, to markets opening again, to streets still standing, to people still breathing. It measured success, not in ideals, but in continuity. And that is the quiet truth beneath these enduring prohibitions. They are not monuments to restraint. They are footprints of endurance. Evidence that the city learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to stay alive with so many lives pressed together, not by asking people to be noble, but by asking them to be careful. And careful in a city like this was enough. In this light, the city's long list of prohibitions begins to feel less judgmental and more intimate. They read not like commandments, but like notes left behind by people who had learned the hard way where the edges were. Each ban marks a place where the city once bent too far and decided not to do that again. Urban Egypt did not have the luxury of forgetting its environment. Heat returned every year. Water shortages returned every season. Fires did not need permission. Disease did not wait for explanation. The city existed in constant negotiation with forces that were indifferent to intention. So survival became a collective project. When one person acted carelessly, the consequences rarely stayed with that person alone. A single flame could erase a street. A sudden rush could injure dozens. A careless gathering could sicken an entire quarter. The city learned that individual freedom, when multiplied too quickly, became collective danger. And so it chose limits. Not dramatic ones, not heroic ones, just enough to slow things down, enough to reduce risk, enough to make tomorrow resemble today. These rules were never meant to elevate the soul or refine the spirit. They were meant to preserve breath, walls, water, and space. They were meant to keep the city standing long enough for another sunrise. Over time, people forgot this origin. They came to believe the bans reflected values, ideals, or character. But beneath every rule was a simpler truth. The city could not afford repeated mistakes. What survived was not morality, but memory embedded in habit. A habit of restraint. A habit of ending early. A habit of choosing quiet over spectacle. And these habits worked. The city endured. Alexandria, Fustat, Cairo changed names, rulers, streets, and skylines. But the underlying logic remained. Reduce risk, preserve flow, protect the fragile balance of too many lives, sharing too little space. In the end, these bans tell a story more honest than any proclamation. They tell us that cities do not survive by demanding greatness from their people. They survive by asking for cooperation, awareness, and restraint. Not because people are untrustworthy, but because cities are delicate. And in places where heat, crowding, and scarcity never fully loosen their grip, survival itself becomes the highest achievement. Quietly, repeatedly, night after night. The bands that never truly left. Many of the rules that once governed life in ancient and medieval Egyptian cities did not vanish when the streets changed names or the centuries moved on. They did not announce their survival. They simply stayed, quietly, patiently, embedded so deeply in daily behavior that most people no longer recognize them as inherited restrictions at all. They feel modern, they feel obvious, they feel like common sense, but they are not. What remains today are not the original bands themselves, but their shadows, soft outlines of older limits, still shaping how people move through public space, how they divide time, how they judge what is acceptable beyond the doorway of the home. Consider the rhythm of the day. The idea that certain hours are appropriate for activity, while others are not. That noise belongs to daylight and restraint to night. That some behaviors feel permissible indoors, but improper once they cross into the street. These are not products of modern planning. They are older than electricity, older than clocks on walls, older than the idea of leisure as a separate category of life. They were born in cities where timing was survival. In Alexandria, Fustat, and Cairo, the day once followed light not out of romance but necessity. Heat made midday dangerous. Darkness made night unpredictable. The city learned when to compress itself and when to release. Over time, these patterns hardened into expectations. Today they feel natural, but they began as calculations. Public behavior carries similar residue. The unspoken rule that one should not draw excessive attention in shared space, that gestures should be contained, that emotion, while allowed, should not spill outward too forcefully. These habits are often described as politeness, courtesy, or social maturity. But beneath them lies something more practical. In dense cities, visibility is risk. To be loud is to gather attention. To gather attention is to gather people, and people once gathered do not always remain predictable. The city learned long ago that preventing escalation mattered more than resolving it. What looks like etiquette is often just early intervention disguised as culture. This is why so many modern expressions still carry the phrase, "That is not something you do outside." Not immoral, not illegal, just not done. The street, even now, is treated differently from the home. It is a shared surface, a collective responsibility. Behavior that is harmless in private acquires weight in public, not because it is wrong, but because it multiplies. This distinction did not emerge from abstract social theory. It emerged from experience. A shout inside a house ends at the wall. A shout in the street travels. A mistake indoors stays contained. A mistake outside spreads. These old calculations still shape instinct. People adjust their voices. They soften their movements. They avoid lingering too long in ways that might slow others down. The logic is rarely articulated. It is felt. Even the modern idea of appropriate behavior carries this lineage, the sense that some actions are too much for public view, even if they harm no one directly. That public space demands moderation, that the city, as a shared organism, requires cooperation more than expression. None of this originates in modern law. It originates in urban memory. The most revealing clue is how often people cannot explain why something feels inappropriate. They say, "It just isn't done," or "It doesn't look right," or "That's not how things work here." These phrases are not moral arguments. They are echoes. Leftovers from a time when the city learned its limits through consequence. And these echoes are strongest in cities that never truly stopped being dense, where streets remained narrow, where people continued to live close enough to hear each other breathe, where climate and scarcity still punished excess. Urban Egypt did not erase its past. It layered over it. Modern infrastructure arrived, but habits stayed. New technology softened risk, but instinct did not update at the same pace. People still behave as if fire could leap roofs, as if crowds could still panic, as if disease could still travel invisibly through proximity alone. Because once it did. And cities remember with the body longer than they remember with words. The result is a modern world that believes it has invented its own rules, when in reality it has inherited them. We think we are choosing restraint. We are often repeating it. The bands no longer announce themselves as bands. They present themselves as norms, as taste, as decency, as what everyone knows. Their origins are obscured not by conspiracy, but by time. What survives is not the rule, but the feeling it created, a subtle hesitation, a quiet correction, a shared sense that some things belong elsewhere. This is how ancient urban logic persists without demanding recognition. It does not ask to be remembered. It only asks to continue working. And it does. What makes these surviving traces so difficult to notice is that they rarely appear as prohibitions anymore. They appear as timing, tone, and expectation. They live in the pauses people insert into their behavior without thinking. They live in the way a person lowers their voice. Instinctively, when stepping outside, even if no one has explicitly told them to do so. They live in the quiet agreement that certain actions, while technically possible, are simply not appropriate for the street. Modern explanations often point to politeness, respect, or culture. But these are later labels applied to much older instincts. Long before such words were used, the city had already trained its inhabitants to sense when behavior risked tipping from individual to collective consequence. The habit survived because it remained useful, even as its original context faded. Take the idea of daily rhythm. The assumption that activity should concentrate into certain hours and dissolve into quiet at others is often treated as a natural feature of civilized life. Yet this rhythm was once a defensive adaptation. Heat, exhaustion, limited light, and fragile infrastructure demanded predictable cycles. A city that did not rest at the same time became harder to manage, harder to protect, harder to heal. So rest was synchronized. Noise was contained. Movement slowed together. Today, even with artificial light and modern systems, the instinct persists. People still feel that some hours are meant for retreat, not display. That nighttime belongs to reduced visibility, reduced sound, reduced interaction. This is not nostalgia. It is inheritance. Public behavior follows the same pattern. Many modern cities still carry the unspoken rule that the street is not a stage, that emotions, arguments, celebrations, and excess belong elsewhere. The discomfort people feel when someone violates this expectation is rarely framed as fear. It is framed as embarrassment. But embarrassment is simply fear that has been socialized. Fear of disruption. Fear of escalation. Fear of drawing too many bodies into the same moment. The phrase "not in public" carries extraordinary weight because it once carried real consequences. A public mistake did not remain a private error. It became a shared risk, and cities remember shared risk longer than individual fault. Even laws today often echo this structure. Many regulations do not target intent, only visibility. What matters is not what someone feels or believes, but where and how it is expressed. This logic did not emerge in modern legal theory. It emerged in narrow streets where too much visibility meant too much attention. Attention, once gathered, was difficult to disperse. This is why modern urban life still prizes smoothness, flow, predictability. The ideal city remains one where nothing unexpected draws too many people too quickly. The ideal street remains one where movement continues uninterrupted. These ideals sound technical. They are not. They are emotional memories translated into design. Urban Egypt across centuries trained people to value continuity over spontaneity, to prefer habits that reduce friction, to see restraint not as loss but as competence. That training did not end when eras changed. It simply adapted to new surfaces. And this is perhaps the most enduring legacy of those ancient and medieval bans. They did not merely remove behaviors, they shaped instincts. They taught generations how to feel safe together in crowded space. The modern city still runs on these instincts. Even when we believe ourselves freer, louder, more expressive, we continue to self-regulate in ways that mirror the past. We stop ourselves before someone else has to. We sense the invisible line before we cross it, not because a rule is written, but because a city once survived by making sure we never needed to remember why. And perhaps the most telling sign that these old bans still live among us is how rarely we question them. We adjust without protest. We comply without feeling constrained. We correct ourselves before anyone else needs to step in. This is not obedience, it is familiarity. The city no longer needs to speak. When people say, "You just don't do that in the street," they are not quoting law. They are echoing centuries of urban experience compressed into instinct. They are repeating lessons learned in cities that were hot, crowded, fragile, and unforgiving of excess. Lessons learned when a single mistake could ripple outward faster than anyone could stop it. Modern life gives us the illusion that we've escaped these constraints. We have lights, water systems, emergency services, and distance. But the habits remain. We still divide time into appropriate and inappropriate hours. We still expect public spaces to remain controlled, predictable, and emotionally restrained. We still feel unease when someone behaves too freely where others must pass. These reactions are not modern inventions. They are old reflexes dressed in new language. What has changed is not the logic, but the explanation. Where once the city said nothing at all, now it offers polite justifications. Courtesy, respect, social harmony. These words soften the edge, but they do not change the structure. The structure is ancient. Urban Egypt, from Alexandria through Fustat to Cairo, taught generations how to survive proximity, how to live among strangers without constant conflict, how to prevent joy from becoming danger, how to prevent visibility from becoming vulnerability. Those lessons did not disappear when centuries passed. They traveled forward, embedded in behavior rather than record. They crossed borders not as laws, but as habits. They shaped cities far beyond Egypt, carried by merchants, administrators, builders, and ordinary people who simply knew what worked. And what worked was restraint. Not moral restraint, not spiritual restraint, but spatial restraint. An understanding that cities are not endless containers. They have limits. They demand cooperation not because cooperation is noble, but because it is necessary. They reward those who move carefully and punish quietly those who do not. So when we look at modern urban life and believe our rules are new, we are mistaken. We are living among the after-images of very old decisions. Decisions made not in theory, but in heat, smoke, noise, and crowding. The bans may no longer be written, they may no longer be enforced explicitly, but they remain, they live in tone, they live in timing, they live in the shared sense that some things simply do not belong in public. Not because they are wrong, but because the city, long ago, learned it could not afford them. And so these prohibitions endure longer than memory, longer than explanation, longer than the names of those who caused the first trouble. They endure because they solved a problem cities never stopped having. Too many people, too little space, and the constant need to make tomorrow possible. That is why these old bands still breathe quietly through modern streets. Not as relics, not as traditions we consciously honor, but as instincts we no longer notice. The city remembers even when we do not, and it always has. Nothing was banned because people were bad. In the end, it is tempting to believe that all these bans existed because people needed to be taught how to behave, that cities were moral classrooms, patiently correcting flawed individuals, that somewhere, someone believed humanity could be improved through restriction. This is a comforting story. It is also almost entirely wrong. Most things were not banned because people were immoral. They were banned because people were predictable in crowds, predictable in heat, predictable when bored, tired, excited, or curious. Cities did not try to change human nature. They tried to survive it. Urban Egypt did not assume the worst of people. It assumed the most ordinary version of them. Someone would shout. Someone would gather others. Someone would light something they should not. Someone would linger too long. Someone would follow sound instead of reason. And then, quite accidentally, the street would stop functioning. That was enough. No villain was required, no dramatic crime, no ideology. Just one small action multiplied by density. This is where the humor begins, if you listen closely. So many prohibitions that later generations treat as moral guidance are, in reality, the city sighing deeply and saying, "We cannot do this again." Not angrily, not judgmentally, just tired. One person did something enjoyable. 10 people joined. 100 people blocked the street. And suddenly, the city had a problem. The solution was not to lecture the crowd. Lectures require attention. Attention creates crowds. Crowds were the problem. So the city did the most efficient thing possible. It erased the behavior. And then it moved on. Centuries later, people look at these bans and imagine intention where there was only exhaustion. They imagine careful planning where there was only reaction. They imagine moral clarity where there was only spatial panic. This misunderstanding is persistent because it flatters us. It allows us to believe that our ancestors were deeply concerned with virtue when in fact they were mostly concerned with tomorrow morning. They wanted the market to open. They wanted the water to arrive. They wanted the street not to burn. That was the full ambition. What makes this quietly funny is how seriously we now take these inherited limits. We defend them, we explain them, we dress them in modern language. We pretend they emerged from thoughtful philosophy rather than accumulated experience. With disaster, we say things like, "It's inappropriate," "It's not proper," "It's just not done." As if the city itself has opinions, but the city does not have opinions. It has memory, and memory in cities is not sentimental. It is practical. Urban memory remembers what disrupts flow. It remembers what slows movement. It remembers what attracts too many bodies too quickly. It does not remember names. It does not remember stories. It remembers patterns. Someone did something once. It caused trouble. The city adjusted. End of narrative. Everything else came later. The irony is that these bans worked so well that they erased their own justification. By preventing repetition, they eliminated the evidence. Later generations inherited only the rule, not the reason. And humans, uncomfortable with rules without reasons, invented explanations. They called it discipline. They called it decency. They called it culture. None of these are wrong. They are just incomplete. The real explanation is less elegant. The city could not afford to trust enthusiasm. Enthusiasm spreads. Fire spreads. Disease spreads. Crowds spread. The city learned to distrust anything that spreads faster than infrastructure can respond, so it banned the spread. What is amusing in a dry and very human way is that we continue to do this today while insisting we are more advanced. We still regulate noise. We still control gatherings. We still restrict movement at certain hours. We still panic when crowds behave unpredictably. We just use newer words: safety, regulation, public order. Different vocabulary, same instinct. We have not escaped the logic of medieval urban Egypt. We have inherited it. We have polished it. We have forgotten where it came from. And forgetting, as you have seen, is the final step in making a ban permanent. This is why so many of these rules feel non-negotiable even now. They do not feel imposed. They feel obvious, like gravity, like walls, like doors that open one way and not another. We laugh at the idea that one person ruined it for everyone. But that phrase is closer to truth than we like to admit. One person did not ruin it because they were bad. They ruined it because cities amplify mistakes, and once amplified, the city does not forgive. It adapts, quietly, permanently. So if this story leaves you with a smile, let it be a gentle one, not mocking, not superior, just aware. Aware that cities are not moral beings. They are fragile systems. They survive not by trusting our best intentions, but by preparing for our most average behavior. Aware that many of the things we call proper conduct are really ancient emergency measures that worked so well we forgot they were ever emergencies. Aware that the city does not ask us to be perfect. It asks us to be manageable. And if that feels slightly ironic, slightly absurd, slightly funny, in a dry, late-night way, that is because it is. History is full of grand collapses and dramatic rises, but it is also full of small rules born from inconvenience, panic, and very human error. Rules that stayed, rules that hardened, rules that outlived memory. And tonight, as the city around you settles into its familiar quiet, you are still living inside their long shadow. Not because someone wanted it that way, but because once something works, cities tend not to ask questions. They simply repeat it. And that is where this story rests, not with a lesson to remember or a rule to follow, but with a quiet recognition. Cities did not survive because people became wiser, kinder, or more disciplined. They survived because habits accumulated, Mistakes were remembered just long enough to be removed, and repetition slowly replaced explanation. Nothing here asks to be admired. Nothing asks to be judged. It simply continues. If this journey through ancient and medieval urban Egypt has stayed with you tonight, even briefly, then thank you for lending it your attention. Attention, after all, is the rarest thing a crowded city ever allowed. Thank you for listening slowly. Thank you for listening quietly. Thank you for letting these streets, rules, and forgotten decisions pass through without needing to resolve into meaning. If this calm helped you feel steady or curious or simply a little less awake, you're welcome to stay. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and allows these nights to continue without urgency. For now, there is nothing more to add. No final warning, no final rule, just the understanding that cities endure not through greatness, but through balance, habit, and restraint, practiced without ceremony. So wherever you are listening from, may your streets remain calm, your nights uneventful, and your sleep uninterrupted. Thank you for being here. Good night and rest